Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today, we're looking at something that is a really big step for English learners. It's that shift from always translating in your head to actually thinking in English directly. And, you've sent me some super interesting stuff about this and offering these concrete steps that people can take to break free from that mental back and forth that happens in your brain. So our goal today is to unpack those strategies, understand why they work, and maybe even more importantly, help our listeners actually start using them.
Yeah, exactly. What's really cool is that so many learners struggle with this, right? These sources we're looking at today, they really capture that feeling of always needing to use your native language as this middleman, whenever you're trying to understand or speak English. And honestly, it can really become a bottleneck, slowing down your fluency and making it way harder to really engage in conversations naturally.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's like you're processing everything twice. Like English
Mm.
comes in, it gets translated. You think about it in your first language,
Right.
and then you have to translate it back out. That sounds exhausting. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people listening know exactly what we're talking about. But what I found so interesting in all of this stuff is that there's this real potential for aha moments. Like you can actually understand why this happens and then get real tools to change that process.
So, okay, let's start at the beginning. Why do our brains automatically jump to translation?
Well, if you think about how a lot of us learn English in the beginning, it makes sense. Like, think back to when you were first starting out. We often focus so much on memorizing vocabulary, big lists with direct translations, and, understanding grammar rules by comparing them to how our own language works. And even doing those exercises where you translate whole sentences back and forth.
Yeah, so it's almost like we're training our brains to think that our first language is the only way to understand English. Exactly. So the
Yeah.
brain's efficient, right? It finds this kind of shortcut. It's a path it's already used to. So whenever you run into English, it just automatically goes to translation because honestly, that's what it's been trained to do the most. And it's super important for people to get this, that this is incredibly common. It doesn't mean you're a bad language learner. A lot of the time, it's just because of the way we've been taught.
That's helpful. It's like, it's not some personal struggle. It's more of a habit that you picked up and you can unlearn it.
Exactly. And the big takeaway here, and this is something your sources really hit on, is that your brain has already done something amazing. It learned how to think in a whole language once.
Yeah.
That's huge. And because of neuroplasticity, the same thing that let you do that the first time can help you learn to think in English directly. It's
Right.
that amazing ability your brain has to kind of reshape itself based on what you learn and experience. That's why even if you always translate now, your brain can totally learn to think in English without that step.
All right, so now we get the why. Now for the fun part. How do we make those new pathways? Your sources give us 6 really interesting strategies to start thinking in English. So let's jump into the first one. It's labeling your environment, which sounds kind of simple. Why is this so effective?
Well, the cool thing is how direct it is. By making yourself name things around you in English, your computer, your mug, the door, without translating in your head, you're making this direct link between the thing and the English word. And it seems simple, but it uses how your brain naturally connects words with images, so that connection gets stronger in the English part of your brain, and slowly you depend less on that native language label. It's about making those pathways that completely skip over your first language.
So instead of seeing, say, ventana and then thinking window, you're seeing a window and connecting that English word right to what you see.
Exactly. And the sources are right to say start small and be consistent. You don't have to suddenly know every single thing in English, but try to label a few things throughout your day. And that can already start to make a difference. Like if you're in the kitchen and you think of the word for knife in your language, make that extra effort to think knife instead and really connect it to that thing you use for cutting.
Makes sense. It's like building those connections little by little just by practicing consistently. And then the second strategy builds on this, describing what's happening around you. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like taking that labeling and making it more active, right?
Yeah, it is. You go from just names to actually describing what you see. And the way to do this is by talking to yourself silently in English. So if you're commuting and you see someone walking their dog, instead of just watching, you think, that person is walking a dog. Or the traffic is moving slowly today.
It's like you become your own internal English commentator for your everyday life.
Totally. And like the sources say, you don't have to talk out loud, which can feel weird at first. Doing it in your head lets you practice all the time without any pressure. Think about all those everyday things you do, like chores, waiting in line, people watching in the park. These all become chances to process the world directly in English. Actually, when I was learning another language, I did that silent narration thing. It felt strange at first, but I was really surprised by how quickly it helped me start thinking in that language.
That's cool to hear. It makes it feel more real. So the third strategy is inner conversations, which is super interesting. How does just talking to yourself in English in your head actually help you think in English?
This one's awesome because it's like a safe space to practice, to get ready for real conversations. It's basically simulating a conversation, but you don't have to answer right away. Your sources give some great examples, like thinking about how you'd answer if someone asked you about your weekend or how you'd introduce yourself to someone new.
So it's like a mental rehearsal. It's not just single words or descriptions. You're putting sentences together and practicing how a conversation flows, even if it's just with yourself.
Exactly. It helps you get comfortable with forming your thoughts directly in English, thinking about what the other person might say, and just building that confidence. You can even try role-playing different situations in your head, like a quick chat with a coworker, a casual conversation with a neighbor, or asking for directions. The more you do these inner dialogues, the easier and more natural it'll be to speak English in the real world.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like athletes visualizing before a big game. You're getting your brain ready. So strategy number 4 is thinking in simple English first, which might sound weird to some people who want to sound really advanced. Why is starting simple so important to stop translating in your head?
The sources are spot on with this one. When you try to say something super complicated in English, your brain is more likely to switch back to your native language to handle it and then translate it. But if you choose to think in simple sentences, your brain can get used to the basic patterns of English thought.
Yeah, the example they gave is really good. Instead of saying, I am feeling very exhausted today because I didn't get enough sleep last night, you start by thinking, I am tired. I didn't sleep well. Same meaning, but much simpler and more direct English.
Right. It's about building a good foundation. Once you can comfortably think in basic English, you can start adding more difficult words and sentences. But at first, keeping your thoughts clear and simple in English will really help you avoid that translation trap.
It's a good reminder to focus on progress, not perfection, especially when you're just starting out. Okay, so the fifth strategy is to stop immediately looking up words in a dictionary in your first language. This one might sound scary to some people.
It can be, but it's a really powerful way to learn to think for yourself in English. When you immediately reach for a dictionary to find a translation, you're basically saying that you need your native language to understand. The example they gave about describing fridge as "it's the cold box where I keep food" is perfect. So the main idea is, instead of going straight for a translation, try to describe the meaning using English words that you already know. This helps you use more of your vocabulary and think in English more.
So you're forced to work around the word, to use the English you already have to explain the idea.
Yeah. And doing that actually helps you understand the different meanings of English words better. And it also helps you learn to solve problems in English. You're training your brain to find other ways to say things when you don't know a word. And that's super important if you want to become fluent.
So it doesn't mean never use a dictionary, but to try and define or describe the word in English first.
Right. It's about understanding and expressing the meaning completely in English. All right, and finally, strategy number 6. Surround yourself with English. This seems more passive compared to the others.
Yeah, it might seem less active, but it really shapes how your brain handles English. The more you're around the language, listening to podcasts, watching movies and videos, reading, talking to people, the more your brain just naturally starts to understand the rhythm, the patterns, how English flows.
It's like making an English world for your brain to live in. When you're always exposed to English, your brain picks up on things without you even realizing. You start to understand grammar and expressions naturally without having to break them down.
So it's kind of like giving your brain an English bath to soak in. And both the active things like labeling and inner conversations and this more passive immersion work together to make that shift in thinking. Now, the sources also mentioned that this isn't going to happen overnight. What are some things people might struggle with as they try these strategies, and how can they stay motivated?
That's so important to talk about. Changing a habit like mental translation takes time and effort. It's normal to get frustrated, to catch yourself translating, especially when you're tired, stressed, or, under pressure. The key is to not see those times as failures. They're just a normal part of learning.
Right. It's like learning any new skill. You'll have times where you're doing great and times where it feels harder. The sources made a good comparison. Learning a language is like building muscle. You can't just walk into the gym and lift the heaviest weight.
Exactly. And like working out, being consistent is better than doing a lot once in a while. Even just a few minutes each day of practicing in your head, labeling, describing, those inner conversations, like the sources suggest, they really add up, and you'll see results.
And it's so important to not be afraid of making mistakes. That stops a lot of people.
Definitely. Mistakes aren't bad. They actually help you learn. They show you what you need to work on and make your learning stronger.
Hmm.
See them as proof that you're really using the language and trying new things.
So to stay motivated, you need patience, to practice every day, and to be okay with making mistakes. So let's recap what we talked about today. We started with why we translate so much. Often it's just because of how we learned English in the beginning. But the good news is our brains can change and adapt. Then we looked at 6 ways to start thinking in English, labeling things around you, describing what you see, having conversations in your head, using simple English, trying not to look up every word, and surrounding yourself with English. And we talk about how important it is to be patient, practice consistently, and see mistakes as a good thing.
That's a perfect summary. And for you listening, the challenge in the sources is really cool. Spend just 5 minutes today trying one of these techniques. Label things, describe your surroundings, have a little conversation in your head. Even that tiny step can make a big difference in how you think in English.
Totally. It's about starting somewhere. Even a small step can help you break that translation habit and start making those direct connections in your brain.
And this brings up a cool question to think about after you finish listening today. What if you do manage to change your internal language? How might that not only make your English better, but also change how you see and interact with the world? What new ideas and connections could you make when you think directly in a different language? It's really something to explore.